much. So we've got 3 really interesting papers. I enjoyed reading them all. Firstly from Dicle, then from Shubhashni, Linley and Jane, and then finally another one co-authored by Linley, Melissa and Marion. So first of all, Dicle, it's over to you. You're going to be speaking to us today about the spirit of fairness and exploring how the leaders of grassroots community organisation in Sussex attempt to secure distributive justice for all stakeholders. Really excited to hear what you're going to say.
So this is a paper I've been working on. It's at the start of its journey, so it's my early ideas, hence why the title has been changing as well. I've been playing with the title a little bit, but the content's very much the same. It is about, the idea of distributive justice and creating fair outcomes out of basically the work of leadership. As we know, I mean, there's been a lot of talk about values and orienting values in the leadership literature. We see examples of some of Burns's work, Heifetz's work. But I guess, a lot of the times what we find is this illusion of final authority. When we particularly look at one organization, that might be possible. But when we start crossing boundaries, that starts getting blurred. What we also see is some critique in the literature about, from Burns and Dennis Storch's work, that, we often come across these narrow organizational or group interests at the expense of disadvantaged groups. And I guess, more and more, as we've been talking in this conference as well, we're crossing boundaries to tackle our grand challenges because these are quite wicked problems and require a number of organizations, groups, or collectives to come together to find joint solutions. So in these situations, we often lack an overarching hierarchy. We have competing interests and values. As Jean Hartley was also saying, it's a diverse kind of view on what the problem is or what the urgent solution is. And I just put here, Heifetz is one of quotes. It is also that we come across these kind of real issues as we try to tackle and implement things. And then our views of these values might also change. So against that background, I was interested in questions of distributive justice, i.e., in other words, how do you secure a fair division of outcomes for all stakeholders involved in an initiative, or directly or indirectly to benefit from it? And I took a leadership as practice perspective, but I took the perspective in an entitative character. Because I was interested in the diverse interests and power relations, and therefore, I was kind of looking at how different individuals, groups, and collectives kind of came together in their quest to define or not define distributive justice through their work. And this piece of paper actually was inspired by a case I've been tracing for over 18 months. It's coming to 2 years now. It's a project that's trying to come up with a scalable model to decarbonize the railways, but whilst bringing benefits to local communities. And we've got 3 key groups in this project. The first is a grassroots community organization in Sussex. So this is a very local community-based group. We have a social enterprise that's actually being sponsored by a climate emergency charity and a regional sectoral voice about community energy. But at the start of the case, they were struggling with their financing, and a green investment company came in to invest in them. So we've also got them as their kind of key stakeholder. And we've got an arm's length body of the government that will, they're looking to kind of give power to. So the idea is to build a solar farm in Sussex, this social enterprise to work with this arm's length body of the government to then scale it up to other community solar parks and decarbonize the whole railway. So it's an ethnographic study, as I said. It's been going on. I went in initially for 6 months. They wanted me to stay. Actually, they thought the negotiation would last 6 months, and then they start, you know, this kind of work, but they still haven't signed a collaboration agreement, although work is continuing. So it's very interesting. It's a negotiation period of over 18 months. And the analysis draws on frame analysis in the social interactionist tradition and social movements literature. I'm kind of whizzing through this in the interest of time, but we can come back to some of the details, because the story I'm going to tell here today is quite lengthy and detailed, but I wanted to touch on some of the key points around distributive justice. So when the story started, at the start of this case, the grassroots organization initiated this fairness frame, and they positioned it as an alternative to instrumental rationality. They were emphasizing, particularly the chair of this grassroots organization was emphasizing that normal business practice has led humanity into our current situation, and that, you know, they should do things differently. And he was adamant to put this idea of fairness frame into the collaboration agreement with the social enterprise. So this was like the main kind of argument that was going on. And initially, the CEO of this social enterprise and the sponsors of the social enterprise agreed. And I think there was an element of this ideal of fair transition that these organizations, sponsoring organizations, bought into, which is kind of on their websites as well. And they were talking about achieving an equitable balance. But then when they came with the offer, the board of the grassroots organization contested this, saying the terms were unevenly balanced. And, you know, and when they were actually emphasizing this fairness frame, they immediately started using a material artifact, the financial model, saying that, you know, there was an asymmetry of knowledge. There was a moral hazard problem. They couldn't see where the numbers came from, and therefore they weren't sure if things were fair. So they emphasized that there was a need to do an open book approach to ensure a fair split. But then we started seeing the emergence of a financial reality frame from the social enterprise. So the investor in the social enterprise and the CEO and the COO, they all started saying, well, the economics of this initiative is very thin. We have to balance the dream against the financial reality. And they were using actually deadlines to infuse a sense of urgency, saying these are all great things. We want to do better things, but we don't have time. We have to move forward. And the investor of this social enterprise also positioned themselves as a market expert, saying this is how the market goes. So, you know, go with it. So what happened was this grassroots organization, some of the board members had growing distrust because this idea of fairness, they couldn't agree. You know, they thought things were unfair, and they quoted this in some of their kind of retirement letters. And what happened was this, the chair of the grassroots organization had a personal relationship with one of the sponsors of the social enterprise, and really bought into this idea of their vision as well. So he stayed on, some of the people stayed on, and they reconfigured the board, and they started thinking about what their no regrets outcomes were. So they went from this kind of, we want to do everything, ecological diversity, you know, a big community fund, decarbonize our locality, also address fuel poverty, to, you know, what's the kind of things we do with a no regrets policy. And as you can see with some of the quotes, you know, there was this idea that there was a power imbalance. But at the same time, the social enterprise became unhappy with, you know, the inability to move forward. So they tried to take the actually grassroots organization to the side for a bit to be able to move quicker. So they tried to move on their own, but they couldn't do so because they secured a government fund, and that required a community legitimacy, and it was also ingrained in their articles. So they had to, and, you know, being a social enterprise, at the end of the day, they were a commercial organization. So they needed this other organization. And they also, this other organization, the grassroots organization, had access to local lands that they'd secured with a planning permission. And this, you know, they weren't able to actually get access to that. So, you know, they actually as you can see at the end of this slide, there came this idea that we're chained together. So they had to move forward together to make this kind of both of their visions a reality. But for the grassroots organization, although the board changed and they were looking at a no regrets policy, they were still kind of worried about not having a satisfactory level of a fund that they could use to do all these kind of things they wanted to do, and to ensure enough community control of this solar farm. And they were arguing things like, why don't we do first of a kind finance? This is a first of a kind project because, it's got an innovative element. So they wanted the finance to be innovative as well. They looked at other material artifacts, such as they produced a strategic plan to concretize their community fund use. They kept on talking about this open book approach. So the social enterprise investor actually came back, offering an equal standing with shareholders, but with a cap. But when they actually calculated, that still wasn't a sufficient amount. So what then happened was the social enterprise, actually the CEO and the investor came back with the argument that the land that the community group was bringing onto the table had unfair valuation. And this came from the argument that actually the price had been agreed a few years ago, but by the time this kind of idea came to fruition, the land valuation had gone down. What the chair of the grassroots organization said is, yes, this is unfair, but we've already put concrete, we've already, laid these, we've already agreed. So there's a kind of a moral hazard issue here. So then, this unfair land valuation kind of debate went on for a while. And in the end, basically, the grassroots organization said, why can't we do an open book approach? We want to see numbers, and we can go to the landowners and say, this is unfair, we can't make this happen. Which ultimately didn't happen because they didn't agree with the numbers when they saw the numbers. They thought the project wasn't thin, but they found some other savings that they could use. So the grassroots organization also wanted to move forward. So they came up with the idea of fair lobbying. And they said, okay, because the social enterprise CEO and the investor then moved on to saying, well, the arm's length body of the government isn't moving fast enough. We don't know if they'll commit to a long-term deal. So we can't give you more money because we don't know if there's going to be a better scenario out there. So the grassroots organization, wanted to do a fair lobbying. But then again, the CEO of the social enterprise, emphasized the sense of urgency because of their funding. They were getting government funding. They had to adhere to certain deadlines. And that sense of urgency meant that this fair lobbying idea was also parked to the side. Then what happened was because they couldn't move forward, but they were kind of chained together and needed to move forward, the investor of the social enterprise decided to give 10% of shareholding. Initially, they were arguing, we can't give you any shares unless you put in any money because that's fair, that's economically fair, coming back to their economic arguments. But then, they decided to give 10% because, and they said this was unheard of. But still, the grassroots organization, when they calculated, they weren't getting, the no regrets kind of scenario. So they still wanted to actually do some more open work, upside sharing. But then again, the time pressure of this grant funding meant that they couldn't do that. And throughout this journey, the chair of the grassroots organization kept on wanting to put fairness in the agreement, but ultimately he couldn't put that in the agreement either because the lawyers said, well, no agreement can have something like that. That's not the norm. So so this principle was, discussed, but it never made it into the agreement. I'm just going to wrap up because I'm aware of time. I guess coming back to our theorizing about leadership, I thought, I'm still kind of playing with these ideas. But one thing I thought about was, there's in leadership as practice literature, there's an emphasis on democratic ideals in, how the collective organizes. And there's this Quick's work on synergistic impact, but we don't talk about the democratic outcomes of that collective. So I'm thinking, is synergetic impact an enough kind of outcome of leadership as practice? Should we be aiming for, a distributed justice as a more kind of normative kind of aim out there to kind of question things? And I guess the other thing this case shows is the everyday difficulty of realizing the democratic ideals of collective organizing. I mean, there's been a huge kind of political process of reconciling economic and ideological arguments. And there's been these power and knowledge relations because each group has this kind of utilitarian power on each other. And, while one group uses objects to shape, kind of shape moral hazard problems, the other one uses the perception of time pressure and market expertise in their kind of trying to limit the maneuverability of the other group. And what we see through the case is a reconfiguration of the collective, one group trying to take the other one out of the picture for a bit and unable to do so, a board kind of getting reconfigured. So there is that kind of fragmentation and change through the journey. And, ultimately, I guess, as a final note, do they manage to create distributive justice? I guess, that's a big question out there. They did agree on this kind of 10% gifting and left it there. So it is something different to the market norms, but, could we do better? Could things be done better? I guess, those are still questions that are outstanding. And I think this case shows us how difficult those questions are to answer. So yeah, I guess that's within time of, right, Owain?
Absolutely. Thanks ever so much. So you kind of caught me in the middle of copying a link over to the eGov subtheme that Jonathan Gosling, Bridget and I are doing in Vienna next year, because it would be great to get your perspective there. The first thing for me was just to say how great it is to. Can't hear me. Can you hear me now? No.
Yeah, it's better now.